Victor's legs betrayed him, trembling like autumn leaves as he stared at the impossible figure before him. The gaslight cast dancing shadows across her pale face, but those eyes, those damned amber eyes, remained constant, unwavering, achingly familiar. Elena? The name escaped his lips like a prayer torn from a heretic's throat. The child tilted her head, a gesture so perfectly reminiscent of his daughter that Victor's chest constricted. "You used to read to me," she said, her voice carrying that same lilting Czech accent Elena had inherited from her mother. "About the knight who loved his princess so much he forgot how to die." How could she know that? Victor had told Elena that story exactly once, on her final night, when the tuberculosis had painted her cheeks with fever's cruel rouge. It was a tale he'd crafted from his own bitter experience, wrapped in fairy tale language so a dying child might find comfort in her father's monstrous nature. "You're not real." Victor's voice cracked like old parchment. "Elena is dead. Has been dead for 97 years, 4 months and 16 days. The little girl stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the wet cobblestones. The fog seemed to part around her, as if even the night itself recognized something unnatural in her presence. "You counted every day, didn't you, Daddy? Just like you counted every breath I took that last week, when you thought I was sleeping." Victor's supernatural composure, cultivated through 3 centuries of careful control, shattered like cathedral glass. He had indeed counted Elena's labored breaths, had memorized the rhythm of her failing lungs, had held vigil over her small body while wrestling with the vampire's blood burning in his veins. The choice had been simple and impossible: transform his dying daughter into a creature of darkness, or watch her slip away into whatever peace awaited mortal souls. He had chosen mercy. He had chosen wrong. "I buried you myself," Victor whispered, backing against the bookshop door. The iron handle bit into his spine through his wool coat. "In Père Lachaise cemetery, plot 47, beneath the weeping angel statue. I brought you white roses every year until they tore it down in 1967. "I know." Elena's ghostly smile was tinged with infinite sadness. "I watched you sometimes, especially on my birthday, when you'd sit there until dawn and read my favorite poems aloud." The fog thickened around them, transforming familiar Prague into something primordial and strange. Victor could smell something beyond the usual urban mixture of old stone and river water, something that reminded him of sick rooms and grieving fathers, of death accepted too easily. "What do you want?" His voice barely carried across the space between them. Elena reached up to touch the crescent moon birthmark behind her left ear, a gesture Victor remembered with crystalline clarity. She'd done the same thing when nervous, during her mother's funeral, during the long nights when fever made her delirious with pain. "I want to understand why you let me go," she said simply. "You had the power to save me. The man who made you what you are, Matthias, he told you how, but you chose to watch me die instead." Matthias. Victor's maker had indeed visited during Elena's final illness, offering the dark gift that could preserve his daughter forever. But Victor had seen what vampirism meant: the endless hunger, the isolation, the way humanity drained away drop by drop until only appetite remained. He couldn't condemn his innocent child to such existence. "I thought I was protecting you," Victor said, though the words tasted like ashes, "from what I'd become, from what we both would have become." "Were you protecting me?" Elena asked, stepping close enough that Victor should have felt her breath on his face. He felt nothing, no warmth, no life, no presence beyond the visual impossible. "Or were you protecting yourself from watching me become something you couldn't love?" The question hit Victor like a stake through his heart. In all his decades of guilt, through all his careful justifications, he'd never allowed himself to examine that particular motivation. Had his choice been selfless sacrifice or cosmic cowardice? "Elena, Tomorrow night," she interrupted, her form already beginning to fade as the fog swirled thicker. "Meet me where you used to take me to feed the swans, where you promised nothing bad would ever happen to little girls who were brave enough to trust their fathers. Wait! Victor lunged forward, but his hands closed on empty air and dissipating mist. Elena, wait! But she was gone, leaving only the echo of her voice and the scent of white roses, the flowers he'd brought to her grave every year, until guilt finally drove him away from Paris forever. Victor stood alone on the cobblestones, surrounded by fog and the weight of nearly a century's worth of unanswered questions. Above him, the Prague castle bells tolled 1 o'clock, and he realized his carefully constructed life of routine and forgetfulness had just crumbled into dust. Some ghosts, it seemed, refused to remain buried. Victor remained frozen on the cobblestones long after the fog began to dissipate, his supernatural senses cataloguing every detail of the impossible encounter. The scent of white roses lingered like accusation in the autumn air, mixing with Prague's familiar symphony of old stone and river dampness. When the castle bells chimed 2 o'clock, he finally forced himself to move, his key trembling in the lock as he secured Blackthorn antiquarian books for what felt like the last time. The walk to his apartment on Camper Island passed in a haze of disbelief and dread. Victor had purchased the converted Baroque townhouse in 1987, drawn by its proximity to the Vltava River and the way morning mist obscured the windows from prying eyes. 3 floors of carefully curated solitude, filled with first editions and comfortable silence, a sanctuary built on the foundation of forgetting. But as he climbed the narrow stairs to his bedroom, Victor realized how fragile that sanctuary truly was. Every object seemed to mock him with its ordinariness, the leather-bound volumes of Goethe and Neruda lining the walls, the antique gramophone he'd never learned to operate, the Persian rugs chosen for their ability to muffle footsteps rather than their beauty. This wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum where a dead man played at being alive. He didn't sleep. Sleep had become unnecessary decades ago, another mortal habit abandoned along with breathing and the need for warmth. Instead, Victor sat in his reading chair, watching the sky lighten beyond the river while Elena's words circled his mind like carrion birds. Were you protecting me, or were you protecting yourself? By 7 o'clock, he was back at the bookshop, performing the ritual that had defined his existence for the past 17 years. First, the careful inspection of the medieval security system he'd installed after a break-in attempt in 2003. Then the brewing of tea he would never drink, filling the shop with the illusion of human comfort. Finally, the arrangement of new acquisitions in the window display. Today, a collection of Moravian folk tales and a water-damaged copy of Dracula that some tourist had traded for store credit. The irony wasn't lost on him. Victor Blackthorn, purveyor of literary antiquities, keeping Stoker's melodramatic nonsense on prominent display while his own far more complex truth remained buried beneath layers of careful normalcy. Mrs. Svoboda arrived at 8:30, as she had every Tuesday for the past 5 years. The elderly widow browsed the poetry section with reverent fingers, searching for verses that reminded her of her late husband's courtship letters. Victor knew her story, knew all his regular stories, because listening to human pain was somehow easier than confronting his own. "You look tired today, Mr. Blackthorn," she observed, clutching a slim volume of Rilke to her chest. "Perhaps you should take a holiday. Get some fresh air." Fresh air, as if the solution to supernatural torment could be found in something so mundane as a change of scenery. Victor accepted her payment with a smile that felt like grave dirt in his mouth, watching as she shuffled back into the morning crowds of Nerudova Street. The day continued its predictable course. Professor Novak stopped by during his lunch break, hunting for obscure philosophical texts to impress his graduate students. The American tourists wandered in seeking English translations of Kafka, disappointed to learn that authentic first editions cost more than their travel budget. Young Thomas from the cafe next door delivered Victor's usual order: black coffee that would grow cold untouched, and a pastry that would mysteriously disappear to maintain the illusion of human appetite. Each interaction felt like theater now, Victor playing a role he'd perfected through decades of practice, the knowledgeable but slightly mysterious bookshop owner, well-read and cultured with just enough eccentricity to explain his pale complexion and unusual hours, None of them suspected they were conversing with a creature who remembered Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, who had watched the Austro-Hungarian Empire crumble while his daughter's grave grew cold in distant Paris. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Victor found himself standing before the shop's single mirror, an ornate Baroque piece that reflected everything except its owner. The empty glass seemed to ask the same question Elena had posed. What exactly was he protecting by maintaining this elaborate charade of normalcy? The answer came with uncomfortable clarity. He wasn't protecting Prague from a monster, or safeguarding innocent mortals from supernatural danger. He was protecting himself from the weight of authentic feeling, from connections that might demand the vulnerability he'd sworn off the night he chose to let his daughter die, rather than damn her to his cursed existence. When 6 o'clock arrived, Victor locked the register with hands that had begun to tremble again. Elena's invitation echoed in his memory. "Meet me where you used to take me to feed the swans." Petrin Park's pond, where he'd spent countless afternoons watching a mortal child's delight in simple pleasures, making promises no father should ever have to break. As he prepared to close the shop, Victor realized that his carefully constructed life of routine and emotional anesthesia was about to end. Whatever waited for him at that pond would either destroy him completely or force him to become something more than the hollowed-out creature he'd allowed himself to become. The choice was no longer his to make. Victor's hand hovered over the light switch, but he couldn't bring himself to flip it. The simple act of plunging the shop into darkness felt too much like surrender, an acknowledgement that the life he'd constructed here was already over. Through the window, he watched Prague's evening crowds flow past like a river of warm blood, each heartbeat a reminder of what he'd chosen to become instead of what he'd chosen to save. The telephone rang. In 17 years of operating Blackthorn antiquarian books, Victor had never received a call after closing hours. He stared at the ancient rotary phone, a deliberate anachronism that matched his carefully cultivated image, as it continued its brass bell summons. On the 4th ring, his supernatural reflexes betrayed him, and he lifted the receiver. Blackthorn antiquarian books. Silence stretched across the line, filled with the faint static that reminded Victor of radio broadcasts from wars he'd witnessed firsthand. Then, barely audible beneath the electronic whisper, "Daddy, are you still coming to meet me?" Victor's grip tightened until the bakelite receiver cracked. Elena's voice carried the same tremulous hope he remembered from her mortal years, the way she'd sounded when asking if he'd read her another story, if the medicine would make her better, if the coughing meant she was going to join Mama in heaven. "How are you calling me?" His voice emerged as little more than a whisper. "The same way I'm standing in your shop." Victor spun around, nearly dropping the phone. There, between the poetry and philosophy sections, stood Elena in her tattered Victorian dress. Moonlight streaming through the window illuminated her pale form, but cast no shadow. She held an old rotary phone of her own, one Victor recognized with a jolt of memory that nearly drove him to his knees. It was the telephone from their Paris apartment, the one Elena had used to call the doctor during those final nights when Victor's supernatural nature prevented him from venturing into the daylight for help. The same phone he'd destroyed in grief-stricken rage the morning after her funeral. "This isn't possible," Victor breathed into the receiver, though Elena stood close enough to hear him without electronic assistance. "Neither was choosing death over love," she replied, her amber eyes reflecting depths that no 7-year-old should possess. "But you managed that easily enough." Victor set down the cracked receiver and approached his impossible daughter with the caution of a man expecting trapwires. Each step felt like walking through decades of suppressed grief, the weight of accumulated guilt making movement almost impossible. "You're angry," he observed, noting the way shadows seemed to gather around Elena's small frame. "You have every right to be." "I'm not angry, Daddy." Elena's head tilted with that heartbreakingly familiar gesture. "I'm disappointed. There's a difference." The distinction hit Victor harder than rage would have. Anger could be weathered, argued against, justified away. Disappointment was a judgment that burrowed into the soul and nested there like a parasite. "I thought I was saving you," Victor said. the words feeling rehearsed after decades of internal repetition. From the hunger, from the isolation, from becoming what I am. What you are is afraid, Elena replied, her child's voice carrying the weight of supernatural understanding. You weren't protecting me from vampirism, Daddy. You were protecting yourself from having to share eternity with your mistakes. Victor flinched as if struck. That's not... Isn't it? Elena moved closer, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. You'd already lost Mama to cholera. Already failed one person you loved. The idea of watching me struggle with the same darkness, of seeing your daughter become a monster, that scared you more than my death ever did. The accusation hung in the air between them like incense in a cathedral, heavy, inescapable, tinged with the sacred weight of truth. Victor wanted to deny it, to defend the noble sacrifice he'd convinced himself he'd made. But Elena's amber eyes, so like his own, held no malice, only the terrible patience of the dead seeking understanding. What do you want from me? Victor asked, though he suspected he already knew. I want you to choose again, Elena said simply. But this time, choose with love instead of fear. Elena, you're dead. You've been dead for nearly a century. Whatever this is. What this is, Elena interrupted, is your last chance to be the father you were too frightened to become. Tomorrow night, Petrin Park, where you used to promise me that brave little girls always got their happy endings. She began to fade, becoming translucent in the lamplight. Don't disappoint me twice, Daddy. Some things are harder to forgive than death. Victor lunged forward, but his hands closed on empty air. The shop fell silent except for the distant sound of Prague's evening bells and the low dial tone humming from the abandoned receiver. Alone again, Victor realized his ordinary world had just shattered completely. Tomorrow night, he would face a choice that would either damn him forever or finally teach him what it meant to love without conditions. The call to adventure had arrived wearing his daughter's face. Victor stood motionless in the empty shop for what felt like hours, staring at the space where Elena had vanished. The dial tone continued its mechanical drone until he finally replaced the receiver with trembling fingers. The silence that followed felt heavier than the weight of centuries, pregnant with possibility and terror in equal measure. Tomorrow night. Petrin Park. The words echoed in his mind as he mechanically locked the shop and began the familiar walk to Camper Island. But tonight, every step felt like walking toward an execution. His reflection flickered in darkened storefront windows. Pale, hollow-eyed, ancient despite his carefully maintained appearance of middle age. A ghost haunting his own life. By the time he reached his apartment, Victor's carefully cultivated composure had begun to crack. He poured himself a glass of wine he wouldn't drink, then immediately set it aside with such violence that burgundy splashed across his antique Persian rug. The stains spread like spilled blood, and Victor found himself remembering other stains, other nights when his humanity had leaked away drop by precious drop. What if she's right? The thought arrived unbidden, carrying with it a cascade of memories he'd spent decades suppressing. Paris, 1924. Elena's fever spiking as tuberculosis devoured her small lungs. Matthias arriving unannounced, his maker's ancient eyes gleaming with dark promise. The choice is simple, Victor, Matthias had said, settling into the chair beside Elena's sickbed like death himself taking residence. Transform her or bury her. But choose quickly. The window grows narrow. Victor had watched his daughter struggle for each breath, her amber eyes, so like his own, glazed with fever and confusion. She'd called for her mother, dead these past 3 years. Called for sunshine and swan feeding and all the simple mortal joys that vampirism would steal away forever. The memory felt different now, tainted by Elena's supernatural accusations. Had his choice truly been motivated by love, or by the coward's fear that his daughter might someday look at him with the same revulsion he felt for his own reflection? Victor began to pace his sitting room like a caged predator. 3 centuries of existence had taught him to suppress doubt, to justify difficult decisions through philosophical distance. But Elena's presence had shattered that carefully maintained equilibrium, leaving him raw and exposed as a nerve. She wants me to choose again. But choose what, exactly? Elena was dead, had been dead for nearly a century. Whatever supernatural force had brought her to Prague, it couldn't truly offer the resurrection she seemed to promise. Could it? Victor found himself standing before the locked cabinet where he kept his most precious possessions. With shaking fingers, he retrieved an ornate silver key and opened the mahogany doors to reveal his private collection: first edition poetry volumes, antique photographs, and, wrapped in faded silk, Elena's final letter. He'd discovered it beneath her pillow after the funeral, written in the careful cursive their governess had taught her. The paper crackled as Victor unfolded it, the ink faded but still legible after all these years. Dearest Papa, if you are reading this, then I have gone to join Mama in heaven. Please don't be sad for too long. I know you think I don't understand about your special nature, but I'm not as foolish as you believe. I've seen you avoid mirrors and sunlight. I know why you never eat the meals Cook prepares. I want you to know that I would have chosen to stay with you, even if it meant becoming different. Being with Papa is better than being anywhere else. Even heaven, your devoted daughter, Elena. The letter fluttered from Victor's nerveless fingers. She'd known. His precious, dying daughter had understood his vampiric nature and would have accepted transformation to remain with him. The noble sacrifice he'd convinced himself he'd made had been nothing more than cowardice, fear that she would someday reject the monster he'd become. A sound escaped Victor's throat, part sob, part growl of anguish. In protecting Elena from becoming like him, he'd stolen her choice entirely, condemned her to death rather than risk his own emotional vulnerability. But it was too late now. Whatever cosmic justice had sent Elena's spirit to confront him, it couldn't undo nearly a century of consequence. Could it? Victor thought of Petrin Park's moonlit pond, where he'd once promised his mortal daughter that brave fathers never abandoned their children. Tomorrow night, he would either face the truth of his failure or discover that some mistakes were too vast for even supernatural intervention. The grandfather clock in his hallway chimed midnight, marking the beginning of what might be his final day of existence. Victor slumped in his reading chair, clutching Elena's letter to his chest like a talisman against the approaching dawn. He had 24 hours to decide whether he possessed the courage to be the father fear had prevented him from becoming. Crossing the threshold. Dawn found Victor exactly where midnight had left him, collapsed in his reading chair with Elena's letter pressed against his chest like a shield against damnation. But the approaching sunrise brought no comfort, only the terrible clarity that comes with irrevocable decision. He rose stiffly, his supernatural body protesting the night's emotional carnage, and moved through his apartment with the deliberate precision of a man preparing for war. The mundane rituals of mourning felt surreal now, washing his face in cold water, changing into fresh clothes, combing silver from hair that had once been the same amber brown as his daughter's eyes. Each action carried the weight of finality, as if he were performing them for the last time. The antique mirror in his bathroom reflected nothing, but Victor could feel the emptiness where his soul should have been. For nearly 3 centuries, that absence had been a mercy, protection from the weight of accumulated guilt. Now it felt like cowardice made manifest. I want you to choose again. Elena's words followed him as he descended to the street level, past the early morning joggers and dog walkers of Camper Island. These people lived in a world where fathers didn't abandon their children to death, where love didn't require choosing between salvation and damnation. Victor envied them their simple mortality, their freedom from the crushing weight of supernatural consequence. But there was no returning to that innocent world. The threshold beckoned, and Victor found himself walking not toward his bookshop, but toward the very heart of Prague's old town, toward answers he'd spent a century avoiding. The church of Our Lady before Tan rose before him like a medieval accusation, its Gothic spires piercing the morning sky with accusatory fingers. Victor hadn't entered sacred ground since his transformation, but some instinct older than fear drew him up the stone steps. The heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, as if expecting him. Inside, candles flickered before painted saints, whose eyes seemed to follow his movement down the central aisle. Victor expected the usual vampire's punishment: burning flesh, searing pain, divine rejection. Instead, he felt only the hollow ache of a man who had forgotten how to pray. "You seek forgiveness." The voice belonged to Father Conrad, an elderly priest whose knowing eyes suggested he'd seen more than most mortals should. He emerged from the shadows near the altar, moving with the careful grace of advanced age. "I seek understanding," Victor replied, surprised to find his voice steady. "Is it possible to undo a century of consequence?" Father Conrad studied him with the intensity of a confessor who had learned to recognize supernatural penitence. "That depends entirely on what you're willing to sacrifice to obtain it." "Everything," Victor said, and realized he meant it. "I would sacrifice everything to have one more chance to choose correctly." The priest nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you already have your answer. Love requires the willingness to risk damnation for another's salvation. The question isn't whether redemption is possible, it's whether you possess the courage to claim it." Victor thought of Elena's letter, of her willingness to accept transformation rather than abandonment. His daughter had been braver at 7 than he'd managed in 3 centuries of existence. "Tonight," Victor said, the words emerging like a vow, "whatever waits for me at Petrin Park, I won't run from it again." Father Conrad made the sign of the cross, his weathered fingers tracing ancient symbols of protection. "Then go with God, my son. And remember, love that demands no sacrifice is not love at all." Victor left the church with something approaching peace settling over his shoulders like a funeral shroud. The decision was made. Tonight he would face Elena without the armor of careful justification, without the shield of philosophical distance. He would risk everything: his sanity, his existence, his carefully constructed walls, for the chance to finally choose love over fear. The day passed in a blur of final preparations. Victor closed his bookshop early, leaving a note that he would be away indefinitely. He returned to his apartment and wrote letters to his few mortal acquaintances, settling his affairs with the meticulous care of a man who might not survive the evening. As sunset approached, Victor stood before his bathroom mirror one final time, seeing nothing but feeling everything: the weight of centuries, the ache of supernatural loneliness, the terrible hope that some mistakes could still be forgiven. He dressed in his finest suit, the one he'd worn to Elena's funeral nearly a century ago, and placed her letter in his breast pocket like a talisman. Whatever entity waited for him at the park, it would find him exactly as he was: flawed, frightened, but finally willing to risk everything for love. The threshold lay before him, and Victor stepped across it without looking back. His careful world of routine and emotional anesthesia crumbled behind him as he walked toward Petrin Park, toward his daughter, toward a reckoning that would either destroy him or finally teach him what it meant to be a father. There was no returning now. The choice had been made. Tests and allies. The cobblestones of Nerudova Street gleamed wet beneath the street lamps, as Victor made his way through Prague's lesser town. Each step toward Petrin Park felt like walking deeper into a fever dream, the familiar city transforming around him into something alien and charged with supernatural possibility. The tourists and evening strollers seemed to move through a different world entirely, one where fathers didn't face judgment from daughters dead nearly a century. As Victor approached the park's entrance, the first test materialized from the October mist. Matthias. His maker stood beneath the wrought iron gates like a sentinel from Victor's darkest memories, unchanged after all these decades. The ancient vampire's pale eyes held the same predatory intelligence that had once promised salvation and delivered only damnation. His presence here couldn't be coincidence. "You always were sentimental, my child," Matthias said, his voice carrying the faint accent of medieval Hungary. "But this is madness even by your standards." Victor forced himself to continue walking, though every supernatural instinct screamed warnings. "I should have expected you'd sense the disturbance." "Disturbance?" Matthias laughed, the sound like breaking glass. The entire supernatural underworld of Central Europe is buzzing with rumors. A dead child walking, a vampire's grief given form. Some are calling it a miracle. Others, his smile revealed fangs honed by centuries of predation. Others see opportunity. What do you want, Matthias? To save you from yourself, as I have for 300 years. Matthias stepped closer, and Victor caught the scent of old blood and older secrets. This spectre wearing your daughter's face, it's not Elena. It's something far more dangerous. A manifestation of your guilt, perhaps. A psychic parasite feeding on your grief. Walk away now, and I'll help you forget this foolishness. For a moment, Victor wavered. Matthias had guided him through his early years as a vampire, had taught him to survive the crushing weight of immortal existence. The offer of oblivion was tempting, a return to the careful emotional numbness that had protected him for decades. But Elena's letter crinkled in his breast pocket, a reminder of choices unmade and love unexpressed. No, Victor said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. I won't run again. Matthias's expression darkened. Then you force my hand, child. I cannot allow you to expose our kind to whatever supernatural forces you're meddling with. The ancient vampire moved with inhuman speed, but Victor was ready. Desperation and paternal love proved surprisingly effective motivators. He sidestepped Matthias's grasp and continued toward the park's interior, leaving his maker snarling behind him. This isn't finished, Victor. Matthias's voice followed him into the shadows. When this destroys you, don't expect my mercy a second time. Victor pressed deeper into Petrin Park, his supernatural senses alert for additional threats. The paths stretched before him like arteries through a sleeping giant's heart, leading inexorably toward the moonlit pond where Elena waited. But he was no longer alone. A figure emerged from behind an ancient oak, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and knowing eyes. She wore the practical clothing of a university professor, but carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to supernatural encounters. Professor Marie Novak, she introduced herself in accented English. I study unusual phenomena at Charles University. I've been tracking the disturbances around your shop. Victor tensed, ready for another confrontation, but the woman raised her hands peacefully. I'm not here to stop you, Mr. Blackthorne. Quite the opposite. She reached into her satchel and withdrew an old leather journal. I spent 30 years documenting cases like yours, supernatural manifestations triggered by unresolved grief. You're not the first parent to be offered a second chance, though such opportunities are exceedingly rare. Then you know what I'm facing. Professor Novak nodded gravely. A test of faith disguised as a gift of love. The entity you're about to encounter, whether it's truly your daughter's spirit or something else entirely, will demand a choice. But beware, the supernatural world has rules, and breaking them carries consequences that extend far beyond personal redemption. She handed him a small silver pendant depicting a crescent moon. This belonged to a mother who faced a similar trial 50 years ago in Budapest. She succeeded in reuniting with her lost son. But the price? Professor Novak's voice trailed off. Some gifts come with chains attached. Victor accepted the pendant, feeling its weight like concentrated hope. What price? That's what you'll discover tonight. But remember, true love sometimes requires choosing another's well-being over your own happiness. The greatest act of fatherhood might be letting go a second time. As Professor Novak melted back into the shadows, Victor continued toward the pond with new understanding. The supernatural world he'd avoided for decades was testing him, measuring his worthiness through trials designed to strip away pretense and reveal the truth beneath. The silver pendant grew warm against his palm as Elena's presence drew closer, and Victor realized that choosing love over fear was only the beginning. Tonight would teach him whether a vampire could truly learn what it meant to be human. The silver pendant burned against Victor's palm as he approached the moonlit pond, its heat pulsing in rhythm with his immortal heart. The weight of Professor Novak's warnings settled over his shoulders like a funeral shroud, but he pressed forward through the mist-shrouded paths of Petrin Park. Each step brought him closer to Elena, and to a reckoning that would strip away 3 centuries of carefully constructed defenses. The air grew thick with supernatural tension, heavy as storm clouds preparing to break. Victor's enhanced senses detected traces of otherworldly energy clinging to the ancient trees, as if the very fabric of reality had grown thin in this place. Whatever forces had brought Elena back operated by rules far older than his vampiric understanding. Some gifts come with chains attached. Professor Novak's words echoed in his mind as Victor reached a small clearing overlooking the pond. Below, the water reflected the full moon like a mirror of liquid silver, its surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple from some unseen presence beneath. The sight triggered a cascade of memories. Paris, 1922, when he'd taken 5-year-old Elena to feed swans in the Luxembourg Gardens. She'd laughed with such pure delight at their graceful movements, her amber eyes bright with innocent wonder. Now those same eyes would judge him with the weight of supernatural knowledge no child should possess. A twig snapped behind him. Victor spun, fangs extending instinctively, but found only shadows and whispered accusations carried on the October wind. The park had become a theater of judgment, with unseen forces gathering to witness his trial. He could feel their attention like physical pressure against his skin, spirits of the wronged, guardians of cosmic justice, entities whose true nature remained mercifully hidden. Doubts, Victor? The voice belonged to Matthias, but his maker stood 50 meters away through the trees, having followed, despite their earlier confrontation. The ancient vampire's pale face seemed to float in the darkness like a malevolent moon. You still have time to choose wisdom over sentiment, Matthias continued, his words carrying supernatural compulsion honed by centuries of manipulation. Walk away from this madness. Let the dead remain buried where they belong. Victor felt the familiar tug of his maker's will, the psychic chains that had bound him since transformation. For 300 years, he'd obeyed Matthias without question, allowing the ancient vampire to guide his choices and shape his existence. Even his decision to abandon Elena had been influenced by his maker's cold philosophy that mortal attachments were weakness to be severed. But Elena's letter crackled against his chest, a talisman of love stronger than centuries of conditioning. No, Victor said, and felt those ancient chains begin to crack. You taught me to survive, Matthias, but you never taught me to live. Tonight I learned the difference. His maker's expression darkened with supernatural fury. Then you choose damnation. When this destroys you, and it will, remember that you spurned salvation twice. Matthias melted back into the shadows, but Victor could feel his presence lingering at the edge of perception. His maker wouldn't interfere directly. Vampire law forbade such intervention in matters of cosmic judgment, but neither would he offer aid if Victor's choice proved catastrophic. The pendant in Victor's palm grew almost too hot to hold, its silver surface now glowing with faint lunar light. Professor Novak had called it a gift from another parent who'd faced similar trials, but Victor sensed it was more than mere talisman. The crescent moon design seemed to pulse with its own awareness, as if some fragment of another's love had been crystallized within its metal heart. She succeeded in reuniting with her lost son, but the price? What price would the supernatural forces demand from him? Victor's immortal existence, his carefully hoarded memories, the very essence that made him who he was. Standing at the threshold of Elena's judgment, he found himself genuinely uncertain which sacrifice would prove most terrible. A child's laughter drifted across the water, innocent and heartbreaking in its familiarity. Victor's enhanced vision caught movement near the pond's far shore, a small figure in Victorian dress skipping stones across the moonlit surface. Elena, exactly as she'd appeared the night before, untouched by death or time. But now Victor understood the true nature of his approaching trial. This wasn't mere reunion with his lost daughter. It was a test of everything he claimed to value: love versus self-preservation, truth versus comfortable lies. The father he'd failed to become versus the monster he'd chosen to remain. The pendant's heat became unbearable, forcing Victor to close his fist around the burning silver. Pain shot up his arm like liquid fire, but with it came sudden clarity. The supernatural forces gathering around Petrin Park weren't interested in his redemption. They sought to measure the depth of his love through the crucible of ultimate sacrifice. Elena's laughter grew closer, carried on wind that tasted of grave earth and forgotten promises. Victor began his descent toward the pond's edge, each step taking him further from the safety of emotional numbness and deeper into the uncertain territory of a father's love. The approach was ending. The true test was about to begin. The ordeal begins. The moment Victor's feet touched the soft earth at the pond's edge, reality shifted around him like a kaleidoscope of memory and nightmare. The October night dissolved, replaced by the golden afternoon light of Paris, 1924. The familiar sounds of his daughter's final days crashed over him, the wet, desperate coughing that had echoed through their small apartment, the whispered prayers he'd never believed, the steady rhythm of rain against windows that had become the soundtrack to Elena's dying. But this wasn't memory. This was something far more terrible. Elena stood before him exactly as she had on her deathbed, gaunt cheeks flushed with fever, amber eyes bright with tuberculosis and approaching death. Her nightgown hung loose on her wasted frame, and each breath came as a visible struggle. The sight drove Victor to his knees as if struck by a physical blow. "Daddy!" Her voice carried the same heartbreaking hope it had held during those final weeks, when she'd still believed he could somehow save her. "You came back. I knew you would." The silver pendant seared Victor's palm, but the pain was nothing compared to the agony of facing his daughter in her dying moments, not as a ghost or supernatural manifestation, but as the 7-year-old girl whose life he could have saved. The air around them shimmered with otherworldly energy, and Victor realized with growing horror that he wasn't just witnessing Elena's death again. He was being offered the chance to live it. "I'm so sorry, little star," Victor whispered, using his old nickname for her. His voice cracked with 3 centuries of suppressed grief. "I failed you. I chose immortality over fatherhood, and I've regretted it every night since." Elena took a faltering step closer, her small hand reaching toward his face with the trusting gesture he remembered so well. "But you can choose differently now, can't you? Matthias is waiting outside. He'll give you the gift again, but this time you can share it with me. We can be together forever." The words hit Victor like bullets of ice. This was the test, not just confronting his guilt, but facing the exact choice that had damned him originally. The supernatural forces weren't interested in his remorse. They wanted to see if he would make the same selfish decision when offered everything he'd lost. Through the shimmering air, Victor caught glimpses of Matthias approaching with the familiar goblet that had sealed Victor's transformation 300 years ago. His maker's pale eyes gleamed with ancient hunger and darker purpose. The choice was being reconstructed with perfect, terrible precision. "All you have to do is drink, my child." Matthias's voice carried across the phantom reconstruction of their Parisian apartment. "Then offer Elena the same gift. She's young. The transformation will be easier for her than most. You can have your daughter back, Victor. You can finally keep your promise to protect her." Elena's fevered face turned toward him with desperate hope. "Please, Daddy. I don't want to die. I want to stay with you. I want us to be a family again." The pendant's silver burned through Victor's palm as competing truths warred in his immortal heart. He could save Elena, but only by damning her to the same endless existence that had brought him nothing but centuries of isolation and regret. The 7-year-old girl reaching for him with such trust would become a child vampire, frozen in eternal youth but stripped of every possibility for growth, for humanity, for the natural cycle of love and loss that gave mortal life meaning. Professor Novak's warnings echoed through his consciousness. Some gifts come with chains attached. True love sometimes requires choosing another's well-being over your own happiness. "I love you, Elena," Victor said, his voice steady despite the supernatural storm raging around them. "I love you more than my own existence. And because I love you," he forced himself to meet her amber eyes, seeing his own features reflected in her dying face, "I choose to let you go." The goblet fell from Matthias's hands, shattering against phantom floorboards with a sound like breaking promises. Elena's expression shifted from hope to confusion to something approaching pride, the look of a daughter finally seeing her father choose courage over cowardice. "But Daddy," she whispered, her fever-bright eyes beginning to fade, "if you let me die, you'll be alone forever." "I know," Victor said, tears he thought impossible streaming down his vampiric features. "But you'll be free. You'll have the peace I stole from you by hesitating, by making you wait while I wrestled with impossible choices. I should have let you go with love instead of clinging to you with fear." The phantom apartment began to dissolve around them, but Elena's smile remained, radiant and forgiving and achingly beautiful. "I was never angry that you couldn't save me, Daddy. I was only sad that you couldn't forgive yourself." As the supernatural trial collapsed into moonlight and October mist, Victor understood that his true ordeal wasn't choosing between love and immortality. It was learning that sometimes the greatest act of love was accepting loss without trying to cheat death of its natural claim. The real test was just beginning, the dark moment. But as the phantom apartment dissolved completely, Victor felt something fundamental tear apart within his immortal essence. The silver pendant in his palm cracked with an audible snap, its lunar glow flickering like a dying candle. Elena's forgiving smile began to twist into something else, something hungry and triumphant that bore no resemblance to his daughter's gentle spirit. "Foolish vampire," the thing wearing Elena's face hissed as its features melted and reformed into something ancient and predatory. "Did you truly believe your pathetic display of sacrifice would earn redemption? You think choosing correctly this time erases 3 centuries of selfishness?" Victor staggered backward as the creature's true nature revealed itself. Not Elena's spirit, but something that had been feeding on his guilt like a parasitic leech. Its amber eyes now burned with malevolent fire, and its child's voice carried harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "I am every father's failure given form," it snarled, advancing on Victor with impossible grace. "Every moment you chose your own comfort over her suffering, every night you fled into the safety of emotional numbness while her ghost called your name. You cannot love what you have already destroyed, Victor Blackthorn." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. This had never been Elena. It was his own guilt made manifest, a psychological parasite that had grown stronger with each passing decade of self-recrimination. And by confronting it directly, by opening his heart to its manipulations, he had fed it enough emotional energy to achieve true independent existence. Around the pond, reality continued to fracture. The October night sky cracked like broken glass, revealing glimpses of the void beyond, an endless darkness populated by the howling spirits of every parent who had ever failed their children. Victor realized with mounting horror that he wasn't being tested for redemption. He was being harvested. "The true Elena is gone, vampire." The creature laughed, its form shifting between his daughter's dying face and something made of shadow and accusation. "She passed on peacefully decades ago, forgiven you completely, and found the rest you denied her. But I'm your guilt made real, your shame given hunger, and now that you've acknowledged me, I can finally claim what's mine." Victor's supernatural strength began to ebb as the parasite drew more life from his essence. 300 years of carefully suppressed remorse poured out of him like blood from a severed artery, feeding the creature until it began to take on more solid form. His vision blurred as the parasite's feast intensified. From somewhere in the darkness, he heard Matthias's bitter laughter. "I warned you, child. The supernatural world doesn't offer second chances, only more elaborate forms of damnation. You've doomed yourself pursuing a ghost." Victor tried to speak, to call for help, but found his voice stolen along with his strength. The silver pendant's fragments cut into his palm as the creature's psychic assault intensified. Professor Novak's warnings echoed mockingly in his failing consciousness. Some gifts come with chains attached. But she hadn't warned him that some gifts were snares designed to destroy the desperate. The guilt parasite loomed over him now, wearing Elena's face like a mask but radiating ancient hunger. "Your maker offered you oblivion and safety, but you chose sentiment over wisdom. Your human academic offered you knowledge, but you ignored her warnings about prices. You have no one to blame but yourself, failed father. Victor's immortal heart stuttered as the creature's feeding reached critical intensity. Everything he was, 3 centuries of memory, learning, growth, flowed into the parasite's insatiable maw. He could feel himself dissolving, not into peaceful death, but into something worse, complete negation, as if he had never existed at all. Through his fading consciousness, Victor caught one last glimpse of Petrin Park's reality. Professor Novak stood at the tree line, her face etched with grim recognition. She made no move to help, perhaps couldn't help, but her presence confirmed his worst fears. This had happened before. Other desperate parents had fallen to the same trap, consumed by their own guilt made manifest. The creature wearing Elena's face leaned closer, its breath cold as January graves. "Your daughter forgave you long ago, Victor Blackthorne. But you never forgave yourself. That unforgiveness has fed me for decades, and now it will unmake you entirely." As Victor's vision darkened and his essence continued to hemorrhage into the parasite's endless hunger, he understood with crystalline clarity that his moment of apparent courage, choosing to let Elena go, had been exactly what the creature needed. Not his guilt, but his love. Not his selfishness, but his sacrifice. The supernatural trap had been far more sophisticated than he'd imagined. Matthias's footsteps approached through the darkness, but Victor could no longer tell if his maker came to gloat or to claim whatever remnants might survive the feeding. The silver pendant's fragments fell from his nerveless fingers, their faint lunar light finally extinguished. The guilt parasite smiled with Elena's stolen features and began the final consumption of everything Victor Blackthorne had ever been. In the distance, Prague's ancient towers watched with indifferent eyes as another supernatural tragedy reached its inevitable conclusion. All was darkness, all was loss, all seemed lost.